Now, what I wanted to do was, I suppose, have this conversation in three parts. We're thinking about, first, that we need to sort of unpack inequality a bit. You've done it pretty well, actually, both in your paper and in your comments, but because people have different ideas when they're talking about inequality, about what they mean. So we need to think about what we understand about inequality, what we know about how it's changed over time, because there are different views about that, why it's a problem. You've touched on that a bit, but also what are the drivers? What's driving inequality? Because you know that. So I just want to put those four things on the table and pursue them for a little while, and then go on to then look at the role of taxation with inequality, and then how we can get good reforms. So does someone want to make a comment about what kinds of inequality you're concerned about and what you're talking about?
So I guess it's important to say that it is very useful for Labor to be taking a broad view of what constitutes inequality. And of course there are all sorts of inequalities. There's the spatial inequality that you see based on where people live and where they grow up, and the access to services that might occur as a consequence. And of course there's all sorts of inequalities that arise in respect of people's attributes, gender inequality, for example, being one of the obvious ones. We do want to talk about, well, I hope I'm speaking for both of us, maybe I'm not, Andrew can correct me if I'm not. But for me, it was important to talk about economic inequality and political inequality, because the two play into each other's hands, reinforce each other. Economic inequality, I think one of the traps that some people in, for example, the Australian fell into was looking at economic inequality as though that's just a question of income inequality. And I think that's, it just is too narrow. But even just looking at income inequality, the Australian points out that the Gini coefficient has sort of hovered around the same level in the last 10 years, which conveniently is the 10 years since the global financial crisis. But it's beyond doubt, if you look at the Gini coefficient back to the post-war period to today, that it has risen quite significantly. Andrew Lee, our colleague, who is also a professor of economics who has done the nation's leading work in inequality and economic inequality, points out that the share of income that's accruing to the top 1% on the income distribution is much higher today than it has been any other time in the post-war period. We also, I think, though, need to be very clear that when you talk about inequality, you must take into account wealth inequality. Obviously, it will be obvious to anyone who has read our essay that we were both highly influenced by Tom R. Piketty's book Capital, which I think a lot of people here will have read, if only for the Jane Austen references, which I quite enjoyed. But you would, of course, expect us to say that, particularly being influenced by a work like that, income inequality is important. The high managerial, I think he calls them super managers in the book, the high managerial salaries, high executive salaries is an issue. It's an issue that we've both spoken in the Parliament about, but probably probably an issue that contributes more to inequality, economic inequality in this country and across the world, has to be wealth inequality. And it's pretty obvious in Australia, isn't it? Because the value of assets, particularly land, has risen so much more sharply and quickly than consumer prices. We can see asset prices have gone up more quickly than consumer prices. We all feel the pointy end of that when we try to buy a house to live in, or feel the flow-on effects of asset price increases through rentals. When my parents bought their house, they were 24 and 25. My dad worked in the mailroom, he was a shift worker, and my mum was a junior person in her father's retail business, a small business. People in that economic situation right now could not buy a house at age 24, 25. It is just ridiculous. And in fact, it's the price to price to income ratio for houses is now many multiples more than it was in the 1970s. It's now 7 to 8 times. Back then it wasn't. So we can all feel the pointy effects of wealth inequality through asset prices. But of course the point that Piketty makes in his book is that if the rate of return the rate of return from your investment in capital is at a higher rate than economic growth, then of course you end up getting more and more money the more and more capital that you own, and your value, the value of your assets and the income that you earn from them increases more sharply than economic growth, and of course you reinvest that in more assets, and the consequence of that is the concentration of wealth in effectively fewer and fewer hands, isn't it? And that for me is what keeps me up at night. The idea that we're moving to a situation where a smaller and smaller group of people own more and more of the wealth, and the rest of us have to rent it from them, with our depleted political power, meaning that our power to improve our own incomes and wealth is weakened further. That is a dystopian future in my book. So for me, that's a reason why inequality is such a sharp issue.
Thank you. And I think then in that answer, Terri, you've answered a lot of my next question, which what are the problems that are created? I mean, and Andrew, you mentioned them. You pointed to the banner, the inequalities of power, wealth and opportunity that are created by inequality. And if we look at our schooling system, that's a nice example of it. If we look at where people can afford to live, that's another example of how it has other consequences. You haven't talked about inequality at the bottom end much. That is, the people who have little, whose income is growing much slower. I was wondering whether you wanted to say anything, either of you, anything about poverty, which is a form of inequality.
Yeah, look, I guess one of the things we should recognise is, we do touch on this, are the progressive elements of our income taxation system, which have been a useful, although incomplete, support for Australians in the bottom quintile. And I don't think, again, to come back to the sort of initial theme that I outlined, Alice, and it's one of those things that shouldn't go without saying, the effectiveness particularly of our transfers. But I think when we look at tax and inequality, that's the first bit. It then goes to the other bits of the exclusions, and I think there's the two elements that I think we need to grapple with as policymakers. One is the ameliorative goal of providing more support, and there's obviously flow-on consequences in terms of housing, for example, for this house price asset boom. If we look at shelter, we look at Terri touched very briefly on the spatial dimension of inequality, and obviously in our big cities especially, as suburbs start to become more and more homogenous, social and economic exclusion becomes concentrated, and access to opportunities spatially as well as experientially increases as well. So these are the challenges which probably are being protected in an ameliorative sense to some degree in the tax and transfer system, but require serious attention in other social policy arenas. And I guess we've got to look at the three big problems as I see it in Australia at the moment, or three big phenomena. One, company profits record high. Two, wages record low and underemployment very high. Three, almost record levels of underinvestment, failure to reinvest by these companies sitting on their capital. Now, tax is obviously a small but significant part of that, but if we come back to the Piketty thesis, if we don't look at what's happening with this increasing accumulation of wealth, our capacity to exert power on behalf of and with those people in the bottom quintile will become less and less over time.
Thanks very much. And of course, this sort of relates to the issue that you have in your paper, and you mentioned earlier, which is the relationship between inequality and economic growth, and why inequality is bad for growth, which has been increasingly recognised by the World Bank and the OECD. So we know there are various ways that relationship can be. People have less money to spend if they're not doing well. Inequality of opportunity means that people's human capital doesn't get developed, and that has economic impacts, and social cohesions. But I was wondering whether you would like to say more about that, either of you, that relationship.
Yes, definitely. I think on the question of the connection between inequality and economic growth, I was moved to retweet Tony Abbott earlier this week. I don't know if I've ever retweeted Tony Abbott before. I'm not sure. But he tweeted something to Bill saying, "Come off it. You can't have greater inequality and also have economic growth. It's something crazy like that. It was crazy. So I retweeted him and said, this guy thinks that the price of progress is greater inequality. And that actually is what conservative thinking is. They say, yes, it's very sad that we have to have inequality, but we do have to have it because that's how our nation gets ahead. And yes, there is inequality, but the thinking behind it is you've got to have a lot of reward for effort in order to have effort, and therefore in order to have economic growth, and just the natural consequence of that is inequality. So this is what Andrew was saying before about really drilling down into these ideas that are by some people just accepted as laws of nature, that inequality contributes to growth, that inequality just is, whether we like it or not, that inequality is something that will happen. Whereas in fact, as Andrew said, inequality is the product of political choices, and we can make political choices that are contrary to growing inequality as well. And this idea that ever-growing inequality is just the price of progress is one that I think has been, as I said at the beginning, really internalised by people. I tell this story a bit. A director from an ASX 100 company said to me, what does it matter? If a rising tide lifts all boats, what does it matter if some get lifted higher than the others? Now, that is the genuine thinking of some people, and to me it sounds frankly a little naive to think that happens. Because in fact what we see in the country in fact where that saying originated, the US, is that not only has the rising tide not lifted all boats, some of them have been pretty much taking water and capsizing, haven't they? Because you see middle class incomes going backwards, middle class living standards going backwards. And that's the consequence, I think, for the US of their inequality. I don't want to see that happening here. But we're already starting to see the signs of that. You would all know that this year the wage price index was less than CPI. In other words, Australians took a real pay cut. You would also, I think, all be very well aware of the consequence for wages of the kind of erosion of unionisation that we've had over several decades. Now, for me, I think these issues are really important because they go to not only power, living standards, for people who are at the bottom end of the income distribution, who are poor, but for power and living standards for the majority of the population. The poor, the working class, the middle class. And as I said, I think this is an issue that really goes to the heart of what sort of society we want to be. And it's quite right to say that there are obvious reasons why extreme inequality is a drag on economic growth. If people with all the power set the rent and the rest of us have to pay it, that makes it harder for us to have control over our own destinies. If there's a small gated community that's safe for the very, very few and the rest of us are in unsafe areas, that is bad for everyone. If you accept that there's a connection between extreme inequality and conflict, and at worst, undermining peace, and I think most people would accept that, then in fact, and as Andrew has quite rightly reminded me, we've got to pitch to the 1% as well. Do you want to live in that sort of world? So these issues are all really interrelated, I think.
Right, thank you very much for that. Now, I think we need to talk a bit more now about what tax reform, what taxation can do about it. So when we're thinking, when we look at your essay and we think about tax, it at least has two roles in relation to inequality. The direct role it has in taxing more from the wealthy than it does, so that direct progressive role, but then it has a role of increasing the revenue that we can spend on the services and on the transfers that are very, very important in reducing inequality in themselves. So I want you to talk about a bit about both, and do you see any conflict between the both? And how can we reduce that conflict? Particularly when you think of the Nordic countries, which have lower levels of inequality than us, much higher levels of taxation, but also have consumption taxes, which the Labor Party have moved away from. So, these are debates that I think it's important for the Labor Party to have.
Well, thanks. I'll now confess that the real reason we're here is because the Fabians are going to put us on a study tour to Sweden, Denmark and Norway. Fully funded. But I might just answer that with two propositions. The first one is to build on what Terri was saying a moment ago, and I think I'd like to take our propositions a step further in two regards, and to be clearer in introducing a moral dimension to the question of wealth and income inequality at the top, particularly focused on the earnings inequality of the people Thomas Piketty calls super managers. And I just think that point is worth stressing for two reasons, because the logic of the trickle-down gang is, of course, there's this pure ratio between reward and effort, or effort and reward. And the one thing we know about these people who are are being paid massive salaries, however described, at the top end of corporate Australia, is the relationship between their remuneration and their contribution has been irrevocably broken. And I think when we ask how much is enough, which I think is a pretty fair question to be asking of these people, we should also ask for that underpinning justification, because the rest of their logic is all about talented people getting what's due to them. And if you remove the incentives, if you put on oppressive taxation, the talents will not be exercised. We think that is complete crap, I think is the technical term we've been seeking to introduce into the wider debate. And frankly, the adherents haven't been able to put forward much to the contrary. So that's the combination of the moral argument, which I think we do have to make and remake. How much is enough? That goes to the gated community argument, but it also goes to the general settings. I think it also, hopefully, allows us to pivot to this wider conversation, which is about how Australians should relate to one another, what constitutes the sort of social compact that we should strive to construct, I think in much the same way that we did after World War II, when we built a cradle-to-grave social protection web, and I guess refined it with transfers in the 80s and early 90s. And I think it's linking those two together that's absolutely fundamental, recognising, as Terri said, that taxes aren't just about the extractions, it's about the concessions as well. And I think that's probably an area that we can do more work in. We've started with superannuation. There's probably a few other areas we could look at too.
Okay. So you do mention in your essay that you don't see yourself wanting to talk about particular taxations. I'm presuming you don't want me to push you on that. Would you want to make any comment? You know, there is a debate about the Buffett tax. Bill Shorten quite rightly said at the weekend that, in a way, you could argue that both the negative gearing changes and the tax on the trust taxation are a form of Buffett tax, in that they're, well, particularly the super one, the trust ones are saying that you have to pay a certain amount if you run these trusts. So that is a form of the Buffett tax. But I was wondering whether you wanted to say anything more about that.
Sure. So I guess what is really important is making sure that taxation is not exploited. Taxation rules are not exploited, and that the settings are right. So for that reason, I think, and we said this in the essay, the very clear sense that people have that if you're middle class, working class or poor, you have to abide by the rules, pay your taxes, do the right thing. But if you're very, very rich, you can just reduce your taxable income down to zero, avoid paying any income tax through the clever use of deductions, is driving very, very legitimate anger. I'm angry about it. I pay my taxes. You're angry about it. You pay yours. None of us spent $1 million last year on lawyers and accountants to reduce our taxable incomes so that we could pay less income tax. The Buffett tax is a mechanism that's been suggested I think there are people in our show who are rightly worried about unintended consequences of it. For example, when we looked at negative gearing reform, there was a deliberate decision taken to exempt from that investment in early stage startup companies, because you actually want to drive investment in early stage startup companies. You want to drive investment, frankly, in new businesses that might come up with new products and services, or might even just compete with some of our existing businesses. Competition is obviously, I think, probably not fashionable anymore to talk about competition in the same way, but if we want to talk about consumer rights and the benefits to consumers, then I think people want to see more competition. I certainly do. And Andrew was talking about the failure of firms to reinvest their profits back into growth, into jobs in Australia that we're experiencing right now. The fact that capital expenditure is kind of tumbling through the floor at the same time as earnings are really high, and mysteriously shareholder dividend payments are really high too. Or maybe there's a bit of a theory around that says maybe if there was better competition, firms would have more incentive to actually reinvest and get better and to get more competitive. So this is an example of one potential unintended consequence of Buffett tax, reducing the amount of investment that goes into, as I say, early stage startups through capital raising schemes. There could be others. I think there's a live debate in this country about the legitimacy of charitable donations and how far they should be able to be used to be able to reduce your taxable income. But these are all live issues. So I think it's entirely correct for people in our show to be saying we don't want a blunt instrument. We actually want to look at each concession and make a judgment about each concession. So when you say looking at the distribution from trusts is a way of reducing the availability of means by which to reduce taxation, when you say looking at the way that negative gearing works is important for that purpose as well, and when you can add into that our policy measure of capping the deductions that you can make for the cost of managing your tax affairs, the mechanisms are different, but the sentiment and the underpinning values are the same. And I think that's really important when we're talking about the Buffett tax particularly. For me, I think that if we achieve the aim, then I'm pretty agnostic about the mechanism, and I do want to make sure that when we talk about tax concessions, we're doing it in a meaningful and methodical way, and I'm really glad we are.
It's gone.
I think I did it. Oh, here we go.
We got back.
So, the Australian, as I said, in arguing that the way to deal with inequality is to look at tax expenditures. I agree with that. Let's look at the tax expenditures. Of course, tax expenditures is the phrase that is used when you're talking about tax concessions. And if you have a look at the tax expenditures statement, what are some of the biggest tax expenditures? In other words, tax concessions, negative gearing, superannuation tax concessions, the precise things that Labor is looking at.
Did you want to say?
Look, I just want to add two things to that, and one is, I guess, on the substance. And I mean, I agree with everything Terri said about it, about the Buffett rule specifically. But just to emphasise that the reason we highlight it is because it's something that's easy to understand. Terri gave a great exposition about some of the challenges in implementing effective multinational corporate taxation. That's hard to understand. And I think that comes back to the real point that we are keen to advance, which is to better engage more people in these arguments and not push them away through the sort of obfuscation that accountants and maybe even some lawyers are good at. The other point is, and I think we should be clear about this, is one of the worst features of Australian politics is rule in, rule out. And one of the reasons we wrote a long form piece to express our views and frustrations with the Fabians was to actually enable a conversation rather than a story about conflict in the Labor Party. Now, we should be able to have debates about these issues. We have been having them, but the story should be about our shared purpose to look at a range of options to achieve shared objectives rather than confected outrage. I'd like to think that meetings like this, conversations like this can get around that, but I think it'd be remiss not to touch upon that.
Well, I think that really brings me to the last question I wanted to ask before I turn over, which is how we can have that conversation ourselves and within the broader community in a reasonable way. I think also one of the things important to remember about getting community support for tax reform is that it was a trade unionist who once said to me, we will pay taxes if they're paying for something that we want delivered, that is the services are there that we think are useful, so something worthwhile. And secondly, if they're fair, I'm not paying an unfair amount. So those two things, services that are what the community want and need, and progressivity or fairness, which is what you've dealt with. And I suppose the last question is there a role for sort of tax expenditure packages? In a sense, we had it a bit with Medicare when we introduced it. We gave the community something they wanted. We introduced a levy. It doesn't have to be a levy. It can be, a package around negative gearing or something. But is there a role for that in getting community support? It makes the link really more.
Well, the short answer is yes. But I think, again, as a political argument and a tool of engagement more than a strict rule of public policy making, it seems that all the central agencies within government departments are allergic to anything that looks like hypothecation, sometimes for bad reasons, sometimes for good reasons. But I think we have got to get better at articulating the relationship between the contributions all of us make or all of us should be making and the sort of society it founds. And we know that that has been critical in building support for critical programs, critical social supports. I mean, I don't think too many people think the increase in the Medicare levy is the be-all and end-all of either Medicare or indeed the NDIS. But the fact that there is such easy acceptance of an additional impost is for me a great encouragement that if we make the argument for the social compact, support for revenue measures will follow.
And I also think, one of the things that we make a long and perhaps a bit too laboured point about in the essay is language and the power of language in talking about these things. And I was just making a point earlier tonight with some Labor students that I try to say public money rather than taxpayers' money, because taxpayers' money is language that's used by the libertarian right to try to delegitimise taxation and public spending. These small things actually matter. I drew a bit of I don't know if it's a particularly good analogy, but I said to him, look, when I go to a coffee shop and I buy a cup of coffee, I don't then complain about how consumers' money is being used by that firm. Why is consumers' money being used to pay people's wages and invest in coffee machines? I demand that consumers' money be used more appropriately into the future. Because in fact, once we pay our taxes, it's no longer private money. We're talking about money that is being held for the public good and needs to be invested and spent for the public good. These things sound semantic and pedantic and therefore superficial and shallow, but semantics actually really, the construction of meaning of course always matters. The language we use of course always matters. And so these things are important. And I think, the Conservatives know this really well, and that's why they talk about the fact that so much, whatever proportion of your income tax is being spent on the nation's welfare bill. That is about demonising welfare, and it's about implying that a lot of the tax collected by this country is spent on it. Of course, what they mean by that is the aged pension. And I think most people do not begrudge paying the aged pension any more, paying taxes to pay for today's aged pension any more than the people who are currently in receipt of the aged pension begrudged previously paying the taxes that paid the aged pension of people in the past, or paying the taxes that paid for the creation and construction of infrastructure in the past, any more than our children will begrudge paying the taxes for our aged pension, or at least I hope mine won't, who knows. I don't see them as much as I should. So I think we do need to be really careful about that, and that's also a bit of a warning, but you can tell where I'm going with concepts of intergenerational equity. Because when we talk about intergenerational equity, we shouldn't be so narrow as to think that that just means never incurring government debt. Because the people of the future want roads to drive on, or they want rail to ride on, and they also want air that they can breathe and water that they can drink. And they also don't want to live in that dystopian future that I discussed really briefly before. They don't want to live in an unequal society where they can't get a fair go and they can never get ahead, and where social mobility is a thing of the past. So I think when we talk about intergenerational equity in the context of taxation and equality today, we need to be really broad about that as well.